Hello, everyone. My name is Ron Sticka. I'm the program director for the fourth annual PTSD Symposium, which was held on June 26, 2021, here in Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County, Oregon. So, this was a difficult subject to tackle. It was a daunting task, but the results that I have now reviewed tell me, and I hope that you will find and agree, that we covered a lot of very useful information through people in our local area who are paramount experts in so many ways dealing with homelessness issues. Uh, and from this wealth of experience, we've made certain findings and recommendations we hope are useful to you in maybe evaluating problems facing your communities, or just so that you're aware of what is going on and maybe you can find ways to help and engage. An overarching theme it was our resolution that this needs to be a community involved analysis and problem solving task. So this is just a brief overview of what was discussed. And as I say, for some of you, this is a preview. For others, you have already seen those segments and then now are looking at this as possible resource material. And I hope it is useful in that way to you. So I have a few PowerPoint slides prepared. And let me add that this is a remnant of the Zoom process that so many people have been familiar with for the last 16 months or so with the pandemic and the virus and everything that has only enhanced the problems with homelessness. So part of the good news is that we are at least emerging from that situation. So what I'm going to do is go through some slides I have prepared for oversight and review of what was covered during the symposium itself. In my opening comments, I reviewed causes of homelessness. We have a slide on the screen for you now to cover that. I'm not going to read each slide to you, but you can see what we focused in as primary causes: poverty, lack of proper training for family and work, lack of job opportunities, substance abuse, addiction, mental health and behavioral problems, and those who are victims of trauma and abuse being forced from their homes, either adults or children, for their own safety and protection, but not really finding suitable alternates for their own care. So these are the tasks of communities to examine and see what might be done to help people in those situations. I, at the start of the symposium, proposed some potential items for discussion as responses to homelessness. So that slide is now being put up. Find housing that is both suitable and affordable to each person's situation. Mentorship and peer counseling can be very valuable ways to deal with this. Peer counseling in particular, because peers, those who have shared experiences of people they're dealing with, have a greater understanding and are given more trust by the person they're trying to help. So that's just a reality that this is probably a good place to start as a conduit to other mentors and professionals who may have more in-depth knowledge. But we support a teamwork approach, and integral to that process is the person who is in need of the help. They need to be a participant in what is needed for their own betterment. Educational opportunities, on-job training opportunities, treatment for substance abuse and addictions, and professional intervention. All of those need to be considered. It's hard for someone who is in a situation with mental health conditions, PTSD being one that's it's everywhere. It's not just a military condition, but we need to address those with these problems, and they need a lot of help. They need a lot of patience. So don't be affronted if you're not immediately trusted when you're dealing with such people, but try to understand their situation and deal with patience. And there's a lot of people who got to be foster adults, had been in foster care. I was often told, just give them love. Well, people need more than love, but that's also a good starting point. So those were my opening comments, and we proceeded with three separate panels. The first panel dealt with homelessness in general, with focus on Lane County, Oregon. And at the start, the first speaker was the president of our local chamber of commerce, and she had 5 areas that she highlighted. And here's a slide that can be used in evaluating what she was discussing there. So through the Chamber of Commerce, they have come up with a plan for research and maintaining reliable data. What are the problems and how vast is the scope of such problems? 2, seek solutions through partnerships. 3, educate and effectively communicate. 4, innovate and collaborate. And 5, advocate for solutions which benefit all. And this is a proposition and challenge to the business community, to the governing agencies, to the people most directly involved with those. It involves everyone. So it's a situation we all need to be attentive to. And if we're going to defeat the ravages of homelessness, it's going to be a long-term community effort that will possibly bring it to success, but it will take hard work. So with the first panel findings, I encourage you to listen to each speaker in each of these segments. There's a lot of valuable information that I have not reduced into a slide setting. But these were the first panel findings. These I'm not going to read to you, but just take a moment, read those to yourself. And hopefully those points make sense to you. Those topics are embellished during the discussions. And then the recommendations that came out of the first panel, you'll see a common theme being addressed as we move into the second and third panels too. But those items are probably at the core of what are the most urgent matters to be taken up. So read those quietly to yourself. And then we moved on to a second panel with focus on youth homelessness. That's what I see as the most urgent area for care, because many of the youth on the streets, that's not a voluntary action on their part. Many of the youth that are on the streets were placed there by parents or caregivers who basically forced them out of the home. But in some cases, as a result of abuse and maltreatment, the youth undertook to leave the home for their own safety. So lots of issues there, and some different nuances for youth homelessness to be attentive to. The first item on that one, I do want you to pay particular attention to, because it says quick action is needed for health and safety by the 15th night. We actually have an organization in this area called 15th Night, and one of their premises is that it's so dangerous for youth to be on the streets that unless they're removed by the 15th night of being in that status, they're in danger of not being recovered. One matter of urgent care for youth for which they're particularly vulnerable is that they may disappear from the streets and never be heard from again. The reality is that happens. Eugene is a pleasant community, but there are trafficking issues, and sometimes young girls and maybe boys also that just disappear and are never heard from again. So that's a sad situation, and it makes that particularly urgent that the needs of youth on the streets need to be attended to. Many of those who are on the streets have ceased going to school. It's very difficult for them to do so. They need something that helps them continue their educational process and just their development. When people are at a youthful stage, their brain has not yet fully developed, and they're particularly at risk, as with the next bullet point there. If they enter into drug and criminal culture, the brain may suffer neglect or damage from the culture and surroundings environmentally, and that may become an irremediable problem for them. There's a cycle of intergenerational issues from one generation to another with many families. This just seems to be an ongoing situation. These things need professional attention ultimately. And a serious issue on the streets, lack of adequate mental health care. We do have an agency in the Eugene Springfield area called Cahoots. It's discussed during the symposium, but it's an agency through a private foundation that works the streets at night to respond to crises that are ongoing. But crisis intervention is not the cure. We're talking about people that really do need long-term, meaningful care to remove them from the situation they're in. So possible solutions with youth issues: provide as soon as possible accessible, secure shelter, recognizing the particular needs of youth. Offer site-based social and health services. This is a rarity. Some foundations are seeking to reach that level, and this is where it takes government, business, and foundation cooperation for funding sources and the volunteers and professionals needed and financial assistance to make this possible to handle on a large scale. We need to develop motivation on the part of those impacted to return to school, to help them find jobs. Many want detoxification. They've become addicted and need to get out of that vicious cycle. Mentoring and peer assistance services are particularly important. These people who have lacked proper nurturing during their developmental years really need to get some good influences and positive role models in their lives. So develop models overall for long-term care, and none of these homeless problems should be treated in any fashion as a short-term situation. It needs long-term and continuing attention and resolution. Then the third panel focused specifically on veterans. Veterans actually have more programs available in some respects through the Veterans Administration and other foundations set up strictly for those purposes. But one statistic that was particularly alarming from one of our speakers is that the population of veterans are 250% at greater risk that they will end up on the streets homeless, and for average periods as long as 6 years, if you can imagine that. So veterans in particular need a lot of attention and care. With veterans, as with most categories, there are drug and alcohol self-medication issues leading to addiction, and we really need to get people cleaned up and detoxified so that they can move on to more meaningful aspects of their lives. PTSD and trauma-based health needs are particularly relevant for the veteran population, but again, PTSD is a problem, as with other related trauma issues, that populations everywhere run the gamut. Youth, people who are not veterans, and people who are victims of crimes. The list just goes on of those who have been traumatized and need some help getting back to a better state of mental health care. Lack of shelter is a vicious cycle that if you don't have a place to live, how do you hold down a job? And if you don't have a job, how do you hold down a place to live? So there's a lot of intervention and care that needs to be done to make sure people get the attention to the immediate needs they have so that they can focus on their longer term goals. And one of the simple things that we find with people who are homeless, a lot of them don't even have the identification they need to get the records that they may have to have, and can use a lot of help and mentoring in what is the process to get a social security card, to get yourself properly registered, to recover military records that are lost, and so forth. So recommendations from that panel: getting a roof over the head is important, but that's not the solution. That's a starting point. Outreach to help place with services that person is needed. Peer assistance, as I have discussed in other areas, is really important for veterans to have other veterans who have been there and been able to get themselves cleaned up and made useful. It's a very valuable resource. You can use people who have previously been homeless to become those who help other homeless like what they had been. And you're going to hear speakers, if you have not already reviewed these segments, talking about those very issues. And gaining the trust of people who are homeless, that takes a little time. So be aware of all of these background issues and the need for long-term counseling and care. So I came up with just something to help give a process to finding points for talking about, and I came up with strategic ABCs, and this isn't an exhaustive list. You can probably think of other ways, but just ways, starting with A is for awareness. It's important for communities to be aware of the issues. Don't ignore them. Don't put on the blinders and pretend they don't exist. They are there. What are the abuse levels that need to have attention? How is the policing? Is more policing required? Are crimes being investigated and solved? Are activities being provided for homeless people? Or are they just left to wander the streets and be bored? Begging, building is basically reference to resources for homeless people. We could probably do better to have planned development areas where resources that are needed are there on site. So be attentive to those sorts of things. Businesses, don't forget that the businesses are at the core of the solution and feeling the problems associated. So be respectful and mindful of the needs of businesses who can be friends to those trying to solve these problems. Listen to the first segment on that. There was some very interesting discussion. So these are all issues through the strategic ABCs, and there are many more you can think of, but these are things that need to be given attention. Gangs in particular, this was a topic in our third annual symposium, which is also available on our site at ptsdmusicarts.org. Poverty is a leading cause of homelessness. It's also a leading cause of the formation of gangs. So a lot of these things interact. And just two words I want to highlight: foundations and government. Government is good for programs and service goals and the funding resources. Foundations are good from the standpoint that they have volunteers and people willing to work hard, but they struggle sometimes with financial needs. So we need to get everybody together in harmony on the same playing field to really work hard toward finding the needed solutions and deal with things realistically. So strategic plan for development is my input on this based on what was discussed and my own thinking. So if this is useful for strategic plan development, consider the broad community awareness situation. What other issues are there that maybe need to be highlighted for the public so that they understand what maybe needs to be done? And I suggest from several speakers and discussions that it would be very helpful to have reliable statistics, reliable numbers, and that the more effective means of evaluation are determined through maybe canvassing, which includes names and evaluation of the needs of each person. This is one takeaway from the symposium. Treat each person as unique and don't just simply categorize people according to how you perceive them. Everyone has their own unique needs, and it's important to get to know them as people, engage them, and take the time that's necessary to find out the underlying problems. That's trauma-informed care. Those are primarily addressed by professionals because you do have to be careful how that's done. But that's how you get to the root of the problems for cure and then proceed with the course of action that's right for that person and engage the person needing help in the process. They need to be motivated to participate in their own care. Triage is a word I think that's important because the problems with homelessness are overwhelming. That's just a fact. And because of their overwhelming, this is a crisis situation. So we need to look at the needs of each person, and sometimes some will have priorities which advance them in terms of the urgency over others. But all will need attention and do it in the best way that it can be done. And this is going to need a lot of involvement and a lot of intervention. Try to help each person achieve a stable living environment. For whatever support they have, make sure they are trained and qualified to do what they are doing and feel comfortable doing that. But peer support and mentorship cannot be understated as or overstated in terms of the importance of those categories. They're some of the most important things we can do is give suitable guidance to the people needing help. People need to be motivated. They need to proceed with education to enhance their skills and make them more valuable to society. There are many jobs that could be done by people who are homeless, and then they can have a source of income from that. One thing that I've always thought about in terms of homelessness is thinking back to the Great Depression when the Civilian Conservation Corps was brought into being. And did a lot of good things. We're concerned about our climate change and conservation issues. We need to plant a lot of trees. Well, here's a resource for getting some things done that could help our environment. So let's engage people in as many positive ways as we can. So those are my ideas, and that's an overview of what we talked about. I hope this is of use to you, but if you haven't yet seen the three segments, this is just a quick overview, and I encourage you to take advantage of some very interesting and meaningful discussions. And with that, I bid you adieu and watch our site for the next annual symposium, which will be in 2022. And we'll have a theme along the lines of the power of music in treating PTSD and trauma related conditions. Thank you for your time and attention.